Amazing. So happy Monday, everybody. And thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us for the live session. I've had a lot of emails over the weekend since the mail out on Friday of the exercise. So hopefully this one is very helpful. I know it's something that for all of us throughout our entire career is very often a constant question. And the more senior we get, the more of a risk this can feel like when you're making a change in your career and your career trajectory as well. As we're contending with so much change in almost every industry now, it's also something that we're all having to contend with because there's no such thing as a job for life anymore. So the reason this is important from an exercise perspective is having an actual framework and not going purely on intuition and purely on logic can be very, very helpful when it comes to making these decisions and having these discussions as well. Today's session, I'm purely going to run through the exercise and then switch off the recording and have a discussion about people's experience on this one. And that's purely because as with all coaching, but particularly in this scenario, I can't actually give any advice or answer this question for anyone. This really has to be something that people do themselves. So hopefully just walking through the exercise and then going through, I will give some examples, obviously from a confidential or an anonymized basis of some of the debates people have had in their coaching sessions previously when we're going through this topic, just to make sure that people can sort of see that from an alternative perspective. And also, in many cases, it's really nice to know we're not alone when we're having these sort of internal debates as well. So I will crack on with the exercise. The first thing to consider is, why is this really a problem that we need to solve? And the first thing I would call out here is the lost opportunity cost. So on average, an executive will spend over 18 months, which is a year and a half of our lives, debating this. And it's not because we're lacking in information. So we have a lot of information about whether we feel we get paid fairly. We can go out into the market and find out if we really are being paid fairly. We understand our team dynamics. Lots of us are working in organizations where there's a lot of structural change. And really, then you have to also factor in who's in senior leadership, what are the likely changes as a result. You've got your latest performance reviews, and many people at this point in February now are kind of holding out until March, until payday, and bonuses get paid, and then potentially considering a move then. And then also the market conditions, which has to be a critical factor, because if it's a hot market and the market is hiring, then amazing. But if the market really isn't hiring, or if many, many people in your industry are being laid off, then it means that the competition in that market is going to be severe. So it's really thinking about all of these different factors. We've got all of this information, but very often it's the sort of thing that swells around in our mind, or if we wake up in the middle of the night, we start to think about then, as opposed to having a very clear framework to work through it and then at least make an informed decision on the next steps. And it doesn't mean stay or go specifically, but it could just be the next steps that you're going to do. And that's the final part of this exercise. The very first exercise is one that we don't have to share with anyone, but it is really important that we're quite brutal with ourselves on, because we, as humans, we can rationalize anything to do with the status quo. So we will always find a reason. We make decisions with emotion and then we rationalize them with logic and explain them with logic. But we're very often not really honest with ourselves about why we're not moving or why we're not able to make the decision of stay or go. So these are a few examples that I've had come up in coaching sessions one-on-one. The comp is too good to walk away from. So golden handcuffs, particularly in financial services, is very often one of them. And that's very closely also linked with, I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got a family to support, I've got school fees to pay, I've got, if you're in Hong Kong, club membership fees to pay. Everything about the lifestyle can be extremely expensive. And it's completely valid if that's the reason for staying. There is no shame in that whatsoever. At the end of the day, we're supporting families, and that in itself is a big part of purpose, looking after our own people, right? And ourselves. So that's very valid. A lot of people will have a challenge around imposter syndrome, or worrying that they might not find something better, or if they do find something better, whether they can measure up. And that I see a lot with clients who've been in the same organization for a long time. So they have a lot of relationship capital. They're very comfortable with how things work. They're very comfortable that they are performing well or well enough, and they understand the system and how to play the system or work the system so that they know they will be okay. And that can make it very hard to then take a leap into a scary unknown. And that, again, is also very understandable. None of these are non-valid reasons. It's purely that we need to be honest with ourselves about why we're not making the move before we can decide what to do next. Leaving feels like admitting failure is a real challenge, because that means that someone can see that something isn't working out, or if they're in part of a very big restructure, of which many people are at the moment, then actually opting to just leave as part of the restructure can feel like failure, because you have to grieve what you're leaving. But some roles purely just aren't set up for success, or the environment has changed so much that while it may have been set up for success 2 years ago, now it no longer is. And that's nothing to do with the individual, that's purely the environment. And the environment, and specifically our direct manager, will unfortunately have the biggest impact on whether we are going to be successful in our careers than any other factor. So it's just important to think about that and try and take some of the personal stigma out of it when we think, well, it might be like admitting a failure. I don't know what I'd do instead is a great one. And this is where obviously we do a lot of work around things like purpose, and we cover a lot of that in Build Better Lives as well, and harnessing your specific strengths and what you want to be doing, because many of us are going to be working well into our 80s at this rate. Like if you look at the new sort of definition of lifespan and health span, we'll likely live into our hundreds, which means we're going to need to be working longer, and we'll want to be working longer to stay active and engaged and contributing to society as well. So thinking about what we really want to do is important, and also working with someone who can then help you see alternative paths, how you can harness those skills, even using stuff like AI tools, right? To think about like, these are my strengths, get it to pepper you with questions and format, some different alternatives if you didn't want to do what you're currently doing. And then the last couple that I'll touch on here is around things like the sunk cost fallacy of I've invested 12 years here, 15 years here, 20 years here. I don't want to move on. It would be wasteful to leave. But honestly, if we stay in the same environment for too long, we can stagnate very quickly and very easily. Particularly if that's an environment in which there is a fairly mediocre workforce, because you're brought down to the level of the systems in which you're operating. There's only so long you can keep pulling them up. So making sure that you're working, if you do make a decision to leave, going somewhere where you'd be surrounded by people that would motivate you to work harder and stretch yourself is probably a really important motivator for those who are high achievers, of which everyone I know who comes to these masterclasses is. And then the final one I think is much more identity related. And this might be whether you've chosen to leave or whether you're choosing to leave, or whether you've been told to leave effectively as part of a restructure, for want of a better term. And this I see a lot, which is I just don't know who I am outside of this role, this organization, this title. If I've been doing this for 10 years, 20 years, this has become a very core part of my value and my sense of self-worth. And therefore, people very understandably are reluctant to consider changing that because they are afraid of what they might find outside of that, or just the unknown. So this really ought to only take 15 minutes to sit down if we're really honest with ourselves. So quiet corner, cup of tea, notepad, think about the real reasons. And as I said, you don't need to share them with anyone, but it is important to then think about, well, are these based on fear? So is it about the fear of the unknown, or are they strategy type concerns? So if it's a strategy based reason, that's absolutely fine. If it's a fear based reason, that's also absolutely fine, but you need to acknowledge that that's where you're coming from. And therefore you're making a decision with purely emotion as opposed to making one within a framework. And that's where we come to the framework. So I'm sorry, this is quite small on my screen, but there are 5 different criteria here that I would strongly recommend we assess. And it's really a very simple assessment. It's out of 10. So where 1 is really not at all and 10 is a lot, assessing these 5 different things. So whether we're learning and growing, there's that whole saying of either be learning, earning, or preferably both. So if you're learning and growing in a role, and if you've got a 10 on this, then it may well be worth considering staying somewhere, depending on the results of the other ones, but assessing whether you're learning and growing or whether you're stagnating. And this is particularly important with everything changing so rapidly around us, in that if we're not in an area that's encouraging learning and growth, then we're in an area that's increasingly going to be at risk. So we need to think about whether we're learning or growing, whether we have recognition and visibility. And this isn't purely just from our manager. This is outside of that, because as we've seen recently, very often that manager can just disappear overnight. So we need to make sure we've got sponsorship and visibility across the organization, and whether what we're doing and what we're working on really fundamentally matters to the strategy, because those two things will very often be closely linked. So if you're not working on something that clearly delivers the strategic objectives of an organization, and if you're not seen to be, then you probably need to be thinking about, well, how can I either ensure that I am and role craft and move what I'm working on to be more visible, or do I look at whether I need to move somewhere else where I would be given the opportunity to do that kind of work? Manager and that relationship, as I said, unfortunately, this is the number one key determinant. I was always in denial about this. I really, really hated that piece of advice, but it is fundamentally true. If you work for a bad manager, you are going to struggle to have a good career. That's just unfortunately the way it is. If they're not backing you, if they're not helping you grow, if they're not advocating for you and investing their political capital in advancing you, you're going to have a real challenge. So if you're working for someone who takes all of the credit, doesn't really pass down information, doesn't let you grow, it's going to be a real struggle. So you can do it for maybe 1 or 2 roles, but when you're looking at moving and changing roles, it's really important to think about who you would be working for. And then also when you're employing people as well, so if you're the team leader, if you're the manager, whatever it may be, Are you the kind of person you would want to work for? So thinking about that, because also when it comes to attracting talent, that should be a fundamental concern as well. In terms of strategic positioning, so is it building where you want to get to? So if you think about where you want to be in 3 years, maybe even 2 years' time, doesn't need to be, 10 years' time. But is this role going to be either a stepping stone or a role in which you can grow into that position, that role? Are you building the right skills? Are you building the right network? Have you got the right exposure for the career trajectory that you want to plan out? So very often, because we spend so long waiting, it will get so bad in our current role that we will just leap into the next available opportunity. And then that's not necessarily something that is going to set us up for that longer term strategic success. And it's something that we can get away with early in our career. So I'd say the first 10 years of our career, we can probably get away with hopping a little bit. But after that, every time we move is a bigger risk because we really need to establish ourselves. We're getting to that stage where we need to be earning enough financial capital that we can invest and build wealth for the future. And so it really is quite critical that we're thinking a little bit more strategically, hence this framework. And then finally, and it might seem weird because many of you have heard me speak for 4 or 5 weeks about the importance of energy. The fact that I've left this till last, but waking up in the morning and being excited to do what we do is fundamental if we're looking at moving roles. So if we're waking up every morning and we're super drained and we're already having a row in our head with the people that we work with before they even have had their coffee in the day, I would argue if you're doing that more than 3 or 4 days a week, you probably need to be rating this one out of 10 fairly low. Whereas if you're waking up, and yes, there are obviously challenges and we don't all love all parts of our job all the time, but if if it's not closer to an 8, 10, I would be thinking about, well, is this really what I want to do for the next 10 years? So just factoring all of those in. So each of those categories, 1 to 10, then you add them up. And then on the right, then there's obviously just a little thing of like, if you're between 40 and 50, you may want to consider staying unless you really have a significant reason for moving. But as you move down and as your score gets lower and lower, the framework would imply that there's probably some insight around whether you are in the right role now and then what you might want to think about moving forward to. Okay, so the final bit then is the forcing function. So we've got our scores, we've got the information, we will have sat down and thought about this. This one only takes 2 minutes. So the last one I would spend at least half an hour on, if I'm honest, but this one only takes a couple of minutes. And this is really about setting your decision deadline. So let's say I've just done that framework exercise and I'm between 20 and 30. So I know I'm not actually happy where I am now. Then I need a forcing function and to set myself a deadline to say, right, now that that's happened, I need to do something. And we can be provided with this by sort of outside context very easily. So it might be after bonus. It might be at our next performance review if things have not improved. It might be when we've completed a specific project, or it might be something external as well. Like, so very often we're in midlife. Many kids are leaving home now. So it's like, well, now that the kids are through school, I've got a bit more flexibility and I can throw myself more into a new environment, learning more, everything else. Whereas before that wasn't an option. But creating that forcing function and doing it for ourselves means that we can't keep putting things off and we can't keep procrastinating and wasting those 18 months. So for everyone doing this exercise, I would highly recommend then completing the if. So let's say, for example, if by my next performance review, even though I've done everything that we agreed I would do, I am not top performer, then I am going to make the call to leave or whatever it is. So if it happens by, I will either choose to stay or leave, but I will take an action at that point. So that's the forcing function component. And it's just really important that we set those for ourselves because otherwise we can just keep putting it off and putting it off and rationalizing the status quo. Because as humans, we are wired to stay in even bad relationships. So maybe that's a bad relationship at work or at home, but anything because we know it versus the unknown, which is why change is so hard. Giving ourselves a forcing function means we have to face into that decision-making point, and having this framework means that we've at least got data points to help inform parts of it. Having said that, we should never make all decisions completely with data. We really need to think about our gut and our heart as well. And our bodies will physically tell us that stuff as well, but we sort of remove that intuition element. But ensuring that we've got all of this information together means that hopefully we can reduce that time spent, make it far less than 18 months in terms of deciding whether to stay or go, and then mean that you don't have all of that lost opportunity cost where you could be in a new place thriving. And yes, it will take 6 months to get up the learning curve and meet the new people and do all of that. And it will be hard, but hard is not necessarily a bad thing. We're not actually built to be in comfort the entire time. So hard often means growth on the other side. So with that forcing function over, I will stop recording